This is every Chinese aircraft used in World War II, from fragile early war fighters scrambling against impossible odds to trainers converted into combat machines. Some outdated, some ingenious, all thrown into the storm. First up, the fighters. Curtiss Hawk III, a biplane that looked old the day it left the factory, but it was what China had. In 1937, when Japanese bombers crossed the Yangtze, these Hawks were the first to climb. Slow, vulnerable, and incredibly brave in the hands of pilots who flew so low for extra speed they sometimes shaved leaves off treetops. Polikarpov Y-15, the Soviet biplanes that danced in the sky. They didn't have the speed to choose when to fight, but they had the agility to win battles they had no business winning. For an experienced pilot, the I-15 offered everything needed in tight dogfights: sharp response, impossible turns, and the feeling that the aircraft understood its pilot. Polikarpov Y-16, Type 5 and 10. This was the technological leap China desperately needed. Until then, its pilots fought in open biplanes, but the I-16 brought a monoplane fuselage, real speed, and crucially 20mm cannons. For many Chinese pilots, it wasn't just a new airplane, it was their first chance to face Japanese fighters on equal terms. A massive jump in capability before the United States even entered the war. Curtiss Hawk 75, P-36, a small batch with a huge impact. Rugged, stable, with a comfortable cockpit and excellent visibility, luxuries most Chinese pilots had never experienced. It didn't dominate the skies with speed, but it survived longer than almost anything China had. Endurance was a weapon. Curtiss P-40, the fighter that would become the symbol of the Flying Tigers but also served directly in Chinese squadrons. The P-40 couldn't turn with Japanese fighters, but it dove as if it carried extra gravity. Its diving attacks were surgical: close in, drop the weight of the Allison engine, strike, and vanish before the counterattack. It was a fighter that taught Chinese pilots to fight with strategy, not with hope. These fighters, fragile, mismatched, unequal, kept China's sky contested. They didn't win through technology, but through the determination of pilots flying machines that barely should have taken off and still faced the impossible. Light and medium bombers, the wings that kept China fighting. Machines flown with the knowledge that many times there would be no escort and no return. Tupolev SB-2, the Soviet bomber that arrived in China still smelling of fresh paint. In 1937, it was fast enough to outrun Japanese fighters during the first weeks of the war. Chinese crews learned to operate it in a hurry, flying deep strike missions against Japanese columns before the enemy even understood what had hit them. But once Japan introduced more modern fighters, the SB-2 stopped being fast and started being vulnerable. Martin B-10, China's first truly modern bomber. Enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, respectable speed for 1937. It represented a massive leap in professionalism for the Chinese Air Force, but there were far too few of them to shift the war. Each B-10 lost was a strategic wound. Northrop Gamma 2E, a light bomber with the soul of an attack aircraft. Stable, straightforward, excellent for dive missions and tactical support. China used it in crucial early campaigns, striking Japanese bridges and convoys with quick, sharp attacks. It survived because it arrived, hit the target, and vanished without ceremony. Douglas O-38, observation aircraft turned into bombers out of absolute necessity. They dropped small bombs, flew low, and operated where nothing else could be sent. In 1938, seeing an O-38 enter hostile territory was witnessing pure determination. A fragile, unarmored airframe being used as a weapon of war. Consolidated PBY Catalina, rare but real, used by China as a long-range platform for patrol and rescue, especially after 1941. Its enormous range enabled missions no other Chinese aircraft could attempt. A solitary presence over the Pacific, a giant angel hovering above enemy waters. These bombers weren't just machines, they were declarations of resistance. Every successful mission, every target hit, was a reminder that China still had breath, even when the world believed it had already fallen. Training aircraft converted for combat, when necessity became a weapon. When the country ran out of fighters, instructors and cadets were sent to the front in airplanes that were never meant to fire a single bullet. PT-17, Cadet, an American basic flight trainer. In China, it became an improvised attack platform. Machine guns were strapped to the wings, light bombs tied to makeshift mounts, a desperate workaround against far faster Japanese formations. Any other country would have rejected the idea. China turned it into a tactic. Avro 621 Tudor, another trainer never designed for combat, used for reconnaissance, liaison, and occasionally light bombing. Slow, vulnerable, unarmored, but it flew. And flying at that stage of the war was already halfway to resisting. NA-16, a modern trainer by Chinese standards. It helped produce new pilots at record speed. But when the situation worsened, some were sent into real combat. Not as sturdy as a fighter without proper armament, just determined pilots defending critical points of the country. Improvised conversions. Chinese workshops produced true hybrids. Trainers fitted with Lewis guns, about 22-pound bombs, and cockpits reinforced with metal plates salvaged from civilian cars. Not elegant solutions, but possible ones. And they kept China's air defenses alive for months when everything seemed ready to collapse. These aircraft didn't win decisive battles, but they won something more important: time. Time to train new pilots, to receive new aircraft, to keep China fighting when logic said it had nothing left to offer the sky. Reconnaissance aircraft. In a country as vast as China, maps were fragile and rumors were dangerous. To know where the enemy was, and to prove the nation was still resisting, China needed airplanes that could fly far, slow, and alone. These were the machines that climbed into the sky not to fight, but to see. WW2 Corsair. Long before the famous American naval Corsair, China operated this fixed-wing version as an aerial observer. Rugged, with solid range and able to use short runways, crucial for a country with almost no aviation infrastructure. On many missions, the goal wasn't to photograph the enemy, but simply to confirm whether a town still existed. Douglas O2MC, a North American reconnaissance biplane converted for hundreds of roles. Observation, liaison, military mail, and minimal bombing. O2s crossed valleys and mountains carrying orders and returning with vital intelligence. They faced something Japanese fighters couldn't shoot down: the sheer vastness of Chinese territory. Loaning amphibians. Rare amphibious aircraft, but extremely useful in river-rich China. They operated where no other airplane could land. Lakes, estuaries, calm stretches of the Yangtze. Used as coastal observers, emergency transports, and even improvised patrol platforms. Stinson L5 Sentinel. It arrived late but quickly became essential. Light, maneuverable, capable of taking off from improvised clearings. Used to evacuate wounded soldiers, locate Japanese movements, and transport officers between isolated fronts. It was an aircraft that could fit anywhere, and because of that, it reached places the rest of the Air Force simply couldn't. These aircraft rarely appeared in headlines, but without them, the war would have been fought blind. They didn't carry heavy bombs, they carried information, the invisible fuel that kept Chinese resistance alive. Operational support. Aircraft that carried no cannons and never dove on Japanese columns, yet without them, no Chinese mission would reach the front. Sikorsky S-43, an elegant transport flying boat by contemporary standards, but in China it became pure necessity. Used for strategic missions, officer transport, rescue of downed pilots, and long flights over regions with no airfields at all. In the chaos of war, it was the equivalent of a flying ship. When airports didn't exist, it simply landed on water and carried the war forward. Lockheed Model 10 and 12. Civilian American aircraft turned into Chinese military platforms. Used for strategic reconnaissance, agent transport, liaison missions between isolated bases, and even intelligence gathering behind Japanese lines. Their speed and reliability allowed them to cross regions where a heavy military aircraft wouldn't survive. Douglas DC-2 and DC-3, the silent giants of the rear. For a country with limited infrastructure, the DC-3 became a practical miracle, carrying troops, spare parts, ammunition, refugees, and even small vehicles. Its logistical impact was so significant that many historians argue Chinese resistance would have collapsed without the steady airlift these Douglas transports provided. Soviet TB-3. In the early years of the war before the Sino-Soviet split, these bombers and transports served in multiple roles. Supply drops, insertion of Soviet specialists, weapon transport, and even joint bombing missions. The TB-3, huge and slow, looked like a fossil from the 1920s, but in China, having wings mattered more than having modernity. These aircraft didn't shoot down enemy fighters, but they kept everything functioning around those who did. For every pilot fighting at the front, another was flying in the rear, ensuring China could keep fighting the next day. Rare machines, aircraft that shouldn't have appeared in the war, but did. Gloucester Gladiator Mark I, the last British biplane fighter, already outdated when it reached China, but its sturdy frame and surprisingly good maneuverability allowed Chinese pilots to challenge Japanese bombers with a machine whose lineage already belonged to the past. Few in number, significant in symbolism. Fiat CR-32. A small handful of Italian units operated in China. Fast and elegant, agile biplanes with excellent control response. In Europe, they earned fame in the Spanish Civil War. In Asia, they became lethal curiosities, few in number but committed to dangerous missions where every additional aircraft mattered. Fairey 3F. A British relic still in Chinese service for liaison, observation, and secondary duties. An aircraft that looked like it belonged in the 1920s, and indeed it did, yet it remained useful wherever the war demanded nothing more than wings and reliability. Sometimes, survival was enough. Hinskell HS-123. A rare case of an enemy aircraft put to work on the other side. The HS-123 was valued by the Chinese for its ruggedness and ability to operate from extremely short runways. Used with great caution, since spare parts didn't exist, it proved that even captured machines had a role in China's war. Soviet R-5 and Ilyushin DB-3 bombers. Before the Sino-American partnership, there was an intense phase of cooperation with the USSR. During that period, several R-5s and DB-3s flew long-range missions alongside Chinese crews. Few people remember these aircraft today, but they were a real part of the front line, striking Japanese railways, convoys, and airfields. These aircraft didn't change the course of the war, but they changed the course of the lives of those who flew them. In a sky dominated by the enemy, any machine that managed to take off was, in itself, an act of resistance. If you enjoyed this deep dive into China's World War II aviation, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and help keep this series alive. And now the question that decides the next chapter. Which military force do you want to see broken down next? The next episode might be born from your comment. See you next time.